Let's talk a little bit about culture. Specifically, we're going to talk about culture and the social construction of reality. This is going to be a very, in many regards, a kind of abstract section. We've talked a little bit about culture in the past. I'm going to elaborate on it a bit more extensively. Um, and I want to set up an understanding of culture that's going to facilitate your understanding of something that for a lot of people is kind of a challenging aspect of doing sociology, which is this idea of a social construct and what we mean when we say things are socially constructed. So this section will kind of set you up, hopefully, in a way that makes the stuff I talk about in the next lecture as clear as possible. But again, as always, I want to remind people that if this material seems a little bit abstract or hard to pin down, by all means reach out. I will work as hard as I can to explain it. But I do want to give you a heads up that this may be one of those sections where the material is maybe a little bit more abstract, a little bit more challenging to grapple with and understand. But let's start with culture. Culture as a concept is one of the two forces that give rise to and shape social organization, which is the thing that we're really kind of ultimately interested in. The other, of course, is structure, and we'll talk about that in a later lecture as well. Culture consists of all of the ideas and all of the things that are handed down from generation to generation in a society. As I mentioned way back toward the beginning of the semester, there are two ways to think about culture, right? You can think of culture as a product of action. It results from the things that we do, the patterns that we establish as we adapt to and navigate our way around the social world. It is also a conditioning element of future action. It shapes the behaviors that we engage in. And again, we acknowledge that that's kind of a paradoxical dynamic, but nevertheless, still true. So in sociology, we divide culture up into two sort of really broad categories. And the first is what we call material culture. Culture consists of things, right? It is the stuff that we make. It's the stuff that we adapt from the raw material of nature, right? So anything, if you pick up a rock and you use it to kill an animal for the purposes of eating that animal and staying alive, you've turned an element of nature into a tool, right? Nothing's changed about the rock, but you've put it to a particular use, which changes the nature of that rock, especially as something that is now something that can be used for purposes, not originally designed, right? All right, so non-material culture, I think, is interesting. Maybe the more interesting part, and non-material culture is the intangible stuff. I don't want to dismiss the interesting nature of material culture, because I think that the material reality of the world that we live in, including the artifacts and materials that make up our world, have a huge impact on how people behave. Think of the structure of a building, right? Once you build a building, and buildings don't exist in nature, but once you build them, the behavior of people in those buildings is now going to be limited and constrained in some ways, right? If we didn't build a door, you won't be able to pass through a particular wall in that structure. So the material stuff is consequential. The material stuff is really, really interesting to think about. But I think at the end of the day, the stuff that's more interesting to me anyway is the non-material stuff. And by non-material culture, we really mean symbols, language, values, norms, and beliefs, right? So those 5 elements are what make up non-material culture: symbols, language, values, norms, and beliefs. I'm going to talk about all of them, but I'm going to focus here at the beginning of this particular unit on symbols and language, because symbols and language are going to be really indispensable to creating what we call a shared definition of the situation. Now, definition of the situation is a concept that comes to us from this guy named W.I. Thomas. W.I. Thomas was a sociologist at the University of Chicago at the beginning of the 1900s. He did extensive research on immigrant populations that were coming into the city at the time, and he was really interested in the way in which people who had acquired cultural competency in some other place, like a country of origin, came to a new place like Chicago and tried to navigate that social world using tools that were appropriate to a different social world, right? So a kind of culturally speaking, a kind of fish out of water. What would be, sort of the resources that this individual person uses to guide themselves around an environment where, you know, the resources necessary to live the kind of life that they were living in their country of origin may not be as readily available, or might not even be available at all. What does that look like, and what kind of world and what kind of set of experiences would these immigrants have? This definition of the situation is sometimes also called the Thomas theorem, because that's kind of where this comes from. And it's a condition in which perception, right, one's perception of the circumstances, is going to determine how that person behaves. It's expressed in a passage from one of the pieces that he wrote back in 1927, in which he wrote, "If men perceive situations as real, they are real in their consequences." Now, obviously, the language is sort of gendered for a particular period in American history, so it isn't just men, it's people, right? If people perceive situations as real, they are real in their consequences. This is not the same as saying your perception is your reality. And I want to be abundantly clear, because I know a lot of people who use that expression. I had a former dean who makes frequent use of that expression. And I know where she's coming from, so it's not ill-intended, but it's also inaccurate. You know what reality is? Reality is reality. Perception of reality, though, does matter, because our perception of reality is going to determine how we behave in that situation. If I believe I can fly, if that is my perception of reality, I may do something foolish, like jump off the roof of a building. But my perception doesn't become my reality. I will fall to the ground and I will hurt myself, or maybe even die, right? So perception is not reality. But perception is incredibly important in determining how people will behave, until the nature of the world will sort of inevitably rise up and remind them that perception may not necessarily be accurate. But that's really what definition of the situation is getting at, right? Which is that how we perceive or how we understand a situation to be is going to guide our behavior in that situation. When I first started teaching at Harper College, I had a colleague in the anthropology department, right? Anthropology and sociology are what we call a joint department at Harper. And we would regularly go out, usually once a week or once every other week. We'd go out and we'd grab a few drinks late in the week to just sort of talk and decompress and be social. It's one of the things that I really liked about landing at Harper College out of graduate school, was it was a really pleasant environment in which to work, and I had a number of really good colleagues with whom I worked. And I was waiting in the office of one of my anthropology colleagues for our other full-time faculty colleagues to finish up their classes for the day, after which we would go off campus and grab a couple drinks and just chat. And my colleague and I, a woman named Pat Hamlin, we were having a really long, involved conversation. And toward the end of the conversation, it was time to get up and go and meet our colleagues. So I'm sitting in her office, and we both stand up, and she takes a step toward me. We'd had a good sort of informative conversation. I felt like we had really gotten to know each other much better. I was relatively new to Harper College. This may have been sometime in the early fall of 2008. And she put her arm out. Right, just kind of extended her arm as she walked toward me, and I took that to be kind of an overture toward a hug. So I sort of reciprocated by, sort of putting my arms out, and she kind of frowned at me weird and reached past me and grabbed her coat off the hook on the wall behind me. And I was mortified. I was really embarrassed because I had misread the situation. But I would argue that my perception, first of all, was not necessarily out of left field. It was a relatively reasonable interpretation of the behavior that I was observing. The fact that it was wrong didn't change the fact that it conditioned my behavior in that moment, right? So my perception that Pat Hamlin is reaching out for a hug determined my response, which was to reciprocate and not, be a jerk about it. So that's what I mean by definition of the situation, right? We are, at any point in time, we are looking for some clarity and some understanding with regard to the circumstances we find ourselves in. And the reason for that is that our understanding of the circumstances we find ourselves in is going to have significant importance for the behaviors that we engage in. If we can correctly read the situation that we find ourselves in, we know how to behave in that situation, because generally speaking, there's going to be a set of rules or norms that will guide our behavior in that moment, given whatever position we occupy in that particular place at that particular time. So, for example, students in a classroom know how to behave because they correctly define the situation as a classroom situation. They correctly understand themselves to be students and classmates. They've identified this other party, the teacher or the teachers, and everybody's behavior is going to fit together because everybody is sharing a perception of that moment, what that moment is, what it means, and what it implies for how it is we're supposed to conduct ourselves. So we're always looking for some information that would allow us to answer that question of like, what's going on here? And that's what the shared definition allows. A shared definition of the situation allows people to coordinate their behavior together with the behavior of others. In the absence of a shared understanding, we get a situation in which you have two divergent perceptions and misunderstandings occur. So this idea that we need a shared definition of the situation for social interaction to unfold is a really critical insight. It is something that we constantly need to remind ourselves of until we don't forget it, right? Because it's just there. It's an ongoing and enduring feature of the social world. So for sociologists, the next question then is, given the importance of a shared definition of the situation, how does that get created? Right? What allows people to have a shared perception? Because as we'll see in the next unit, everybody has an independent experience of the world around them. We are separate biological organisms, right? We don't share senses with other biological entities. My eyes see the world. My ears hear the world. Your eyes see the world, and your eyes hear the world. But you don't see the world through my eyes or hear the world through my ears, right? Those are separate experiences. And yet somehow we're going to end up agreeing on the perception of the situation, the definition of the situation that we find ourselves in. And so for sociologists, especially social psychologists and symbolic interactionists, this is really fascinating. How does that happen? What mechanisms allow this to kind of unfold? Because it's really fascinating, not just that it happens, but also how it happens. And I will tell you now that the two most important elements in creating that are going to be symbols and language. That's why we're going to focus on those elements of non-material culture in this unit. We'll talk about the other ones a little bit later. So a symbol is something that has shared meaning for two or more people. It's a gesture, it's a sign, it's an object, it's a signal, it's a word, right? It's any number of those things. But the thing that makes a symbol is that it represents something else. And it represents something else to at least two people. A person cannot have their own symbols, right? Symbols by definition have to be shared between at least two people, because that's what makes them symbols, right? That they're a stand-in, they're a representation for something else for at least those two people. And because symbols have shared meaning, people can then use them for the purposes of communication. The meaning of a symbol is not in the symbol itself. That's really, really important to remember. The meaning of symbols, or the the meaning of symbols is kind of arbitrary, right? A meaning certainly gets attached to symbols, but the meaning or meanings that attach to a symbol can be anything, right? It's just as long as people agree that this particular word or this particular gesture or this particular sign means a particular thing, um, um, then it becomes a symbol. So they're created through interaction, they're shared through interaction, they're altered and transformed through interaction. Um, the meaning is a feature of the people using the symbol, not the symbol itself. So let's see if I can demonstrate this. Okay, so this gesture right here, which I think most everybody would call a wave, um, is something that doesn't have any fixed or inherent meaning, right? If we were to just describe the gesture, you probably would not start by saying it's a wave, because that is already kind of entangling the gesture with its meaning. So let's put that aside for a moment. That's the label that we apply to the gesture. But if you think about what the gesture is, it is a hand moving laterally at the end of an extended and upraised arm. Right? That's what this is. It's a hand moving laterally, side to side, at the end of an extended and upraised arm. That's the gesture. What does it mean? Well, first of all, what do we call it? We call it a wave. What does it mean? Well, if people are coming together initially, it means hello, right? I think most everybody kind of agrees on that. What if everybody is leaving and you do this? Does it mean hello? No, it means goodbye. So the exact same gesture, but it's a different symbol. Right? That's why we don't get hung up on what the gesture is. We get hung up on what its meaning is. So you can use this to say hello, and you can also use this to say goodbye. Right? Hello when everyone's coming together, goodbye when everybody's on their way out the door or away from wherever it was you were meeting. What if everybody is already gathered? Let's say it's a classroom situation. Everybody's already gathered. It's not yet time to leave, and the teacher's at the front of the room, and they're making this gesture, right? That might mean, hey, pay attention, right? Maybe the students have started talking amongst themselves. Maybe we're coming back from some individual work where students were talking to each other or doing something independent. But now attention needs to be focused at the front of the room. So now this very same gesture means pay attention. Notice the gesture doesn't alter at all. It's the exact same gesture, a hand moving laterally at the end of an extended and upraised arm. What's changed is the context, right? At the beginning of an interaction, it means one thing. In the middle of an interaction, the exact same gesture can have a different meaning. And at the end of an interaction, the exact same gesture can have a third meaning. Right? This can mean whatever we want it to mean. As long as two or more people agree, this can be an obscene gesture for all we know. Right? It's not, but it could be, because that's the nature of a symbol. We give symbols their meaning. It's not in the symbol or in the phenomena itself. So symbols are really remarkable. Because they take the place of something, they stand in for something else that they represent. Symbols can be used to have experiences vicariously, right? If I talk about, for example, being dumped by a significant other, and anybody listening to me has gone through a breakup, suddenly they can have some sense of empathy and understanding, because they've gone through not my experience, but a similar kind of experience. We can talk about objects and phenomena that are not physically in our presence. So we could talk about cars, or we could talk about airplanes, or we could talk about hotels. Even though we're not driving our cars, we're not in a hotel, we're not looking at an airplane, right? The fact that we can use these symbols to bring those concepts into our awareness and do so in a way that when I say the word car, an image and an idea and an understanding forms in the minds of the people who are hearing that. That's where we are going to create our shared definition of the situation. We're going to do it through symbols and language. And language is just a system of symbols that we use for communication, right? It's ultimately fundamentally symbolic, but it's a little bit more layered. There's a lot more nuance there. But at the end of the day, symbols and language are going to become the foundation for a really deep and meaningful shared understanding of the situation around us, which will become the foundation for, again, what we're going to call the social construction of reality. And that's where we'll pick up next time. So until then, goodbye.